Good morning, everybody. And good morning to all of you who are online. It's good to have you with us today. It's been a very special weekend with the historic first visit of the children of His Majesty's Chapel Royal. Well, she was my queen for all my life. So it's hard to forget. It makes mistakes. It's so wonderful to have the children with us, and it's causing a lot of interest. And of course, the first recorded mention of the children, is 1135. So this tradition is centuries old. We've had a lot of fun with the children as well. They've been with our choristers, having what Canon Wright describes as boot camp, and he would, because Canon Wright is a life. His whole life has been in the army. Serving his country. You were in active deployment in Afghanistan, weren't you?
And Iraq.
Yeah. So, he's on a different front line now. Perhaps this one's more dangerous at times.
Could be.
For that reason, there will be no questions and answers, because you might ask something awkward. No, seriously, it is such a delight to have Canon Paul with us. He's become a good friend of our parish, and a number of us visited the Chapel Royal and in February, we had a wonderful visit with him and with members of the royal household. It was a wonderful trip. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Canon Paul Wright.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Father, for your warm welcome. And it's wonderful, really wonderful to be back here at St Thomas's again and to talk about this morning and to welcome online guests this morning as well, of course, to talk about the coronation and the context of state ceremonial worship, and to give a bit of background to this talk. This talk came out about 2 years ago. I was asked by the military to prepare a series of talks about the role of Christian worship in the military, and why do we have Christian worship within the military, and what is the context and background to it. Now, those talks were delivered at the Staff College in Shrivenham, and they lasted for 3 hours. So please don't panic. This is this is a summary of, a flavour of, a beginning of where does this all come from? State ceremonial. Why do we do things? Why does the British monarchy and the British state do religious services in a certain way? And why are so many of our state occasions in the United Kingdom, why are they based in church services? And if you think about it for a moment, you often see the royal family in church, and because lots of things happen in church. Why is this? And we're in an age of questioning, and people are asking more and more, why is this? People want to sort of know what is the context. I was the chaplain at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, and which is like the West Point, the British version of West Point. It was my last job in the regular army. And on a first session with officer cadets, so a similar number to yourselves, 30 people maybe, sat in a classroom, my first question to them will be, who is a Christian? And there'd be one or two who would sort of put their hands up rather tentatively in a rather fearful way, and who is an agnostic? Who's not so sure? You maybe get half of the hands would go up. Who's an atheist? A lot of hands would go up. So I'd then say to them, okay, and they've all been reading Dawkins at university, so they're all very red hot and all this sort of stuff. So, I'd say, who's a monarchist? Everybody's hand would go up. You see, I say, right. Those of you who are atheists and agnostics have a slight problem, because who makes the Queen, as then was, the Queen? Now, these are all young military officers in training, so they're all slightly scratching their heads now, and they're getting a bit sort of, who makes the Queen the Queen? Parliament. Well, yes, Parliament does, but the action that makes the Queen is the coronation, when the Archbishop of Canterbury puts the crown upon the sovereign's head in Westminster Abbey. Funny old thing, that's a Christian act of worship. So, for those of you who are atheistic or agnostic, you might want to rethink your your approach to monarchy. By which stage they're all thinking, my head really is hurting now, and can we please stop talking about this? So, but that's part of the background, that we live in a secular age, and here in the United States as well, we live in a secular age, and people question, why do we do things in a certain way? And this series of lectures, which is condensed for you this morning, is to give a bit of the background to why things are the way they are. So there's me, the ecclesiastical household. His Majesty's world breaks down into 5 departments: the private secretary, who looks after the constitutional matters, the Commonwealth, the government, all of the business of kingship, the private secretary. Secondly, there is the privy purse, and the privy purse looks after all the money. And there is a privy purse, a beautiful velvet purse from the 12th century that sits in the keeper's office, which used to travel around with the monarch. So the privy purse, the money. The master's department, the master of the household, who's an admiral I served with in Afghanistan in 2012, a personal friend, he looks after everything internally in the royal household. So all the palaces, all the events, all of the things that go on, he looks after. The 4th department is called the Lord Chamberlain's office, run by my old friend, the controller. We served in the army together for 20 years nearly. And Mike, as controller, he looks after all the king's horses and all the king's men. So the stables, the royal mews, the medical household, the ecclesiastical household, the central chancery, that's all the medals and all the stuff. And basically, and the outward face, the ceremonial. So in effect, I'm in the ceremonial department, but it's called the Lord Chamberlain's office. And within it, I look after the ecclesiastical household. That's my job. So what is the ecclesiastical household? Well, here are the members of the ecclesiastical household, and you were looking at all of them. They are all here today with you. As Gilbert and Sullivan say in Iolanthe about the House of Lords, we do nothing in particular, but do it rather well. And that is so that's the ecclesiastical household. And that breaks down into a number of chapels royal. In London, St James's Palace, where I work and live, and we have 4 private chapels: St James's, the Queen's Chapel, Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, which are the chapels of the direct royal family in London. And then just the way that the world worked out from the medieval to the modern in the 16th century. We have a chapel at the Tower of London, a chapel at the Savoy, which is on the Strand, and a chapel at Hampton Court. And I'm drawing a line because that is the River Thames. And the River Thames was the great artery, the great freeway or motorway of Tudor England. And you moved up and down the Thames. It was the best form of communication. So I look after 3 chapels outside of St James's in London, and we have chaplains and we have choirs in all of those places, and they're really worth visiting. Savoy has got a very close connection with Washington, D.C., for instance, and King George VI. They've all got fabulous stories. We then move out to our other chapels. Now, these are independent bodies, but they come under the Lord Chamberlain's office because of state ceremonial. So St George's Chapel, Windsor, which you will all, I think, know and have seen from the various great ceremonies that take place there. Westminster Abbey, an independent body, but also a royal peculiar. And then we have Sandringham Parish Church, where His Majesty spends quite a lot of time in Norfolk. And then north of the border in Scotland, a different church, the Church of Scotland, but ecclesiastically coming under our department is the Crathy Kirk at Balmoral and the Canongate Kirk in Edinburgh, both very interesting and historic buildings. And finally, 3 very special chapels royal in North America, in Canada, the chapels royal of the Mohawk and the chapels royal of the Mississaugas in Toronto, Brantford and Kingston. They all date back to the American Revolution, or Rebellion as we call it in St James's Palace, still to this day. And that, I'm afraid, is another talk, because it's a fascinating talk, but today we're on this National Ceremonial Services. So I had the huge privilege of being very much involved in the funeral service of our late Queen Elizabeth II, and I had the privilege of receiving her coffin back into Buckingham Palace when the coffin returned from London. And it was a remarkable time. Her Majesty was, to the very end, the brightest, the sharpest, the loveliest person you could ever meet. And I think around the whole world was seen and loved and respected as a great leader, a great Christian leader. And her death was a very moving moment for all of us in the household. I've served there for 10 years. I was her last domestic chaplain, and it was a huge privilege and a huge sadness to receive her body back into Buckingham Palace. And then we sent her on the way to Westminster Abbey for the state funeral. That thing was called Operation London Bridge. It was an enormous document, It'd been thought through and rehearsed. We rehearsed it regularly, our moving parts where we were, and the other moving parts around the country, in case it happened in various places. What followed, of course, was the coronation. And you can see me lurking in the background there by the pillar, looking at His Majesty there being crowned on the coronation day. And it was a remarkable day, and there you can see the view down into Westminster Abbey, His Majesty there with the Archbishop of Canterbury. What surprised me, just to digress for a moment, what surprised me, and I'm pointing to our viewers online, when we were sat up there in what is called the Coronation Theatre, the cosmatic pavement of Westminster Abbey, we had these cameras all around us, these little type cameras, and it was quite extraordinary because you really felt the pressure of the fact that the media were all around us on this day. It was really very, very exposed. The only coronation previously, that of late Queen Elizabeth II, of course, black and white, television, 1953, but very long shots of the events, very sort of shots in the distance, whereas this coronation, very up close, very personal, very much of our time, and really interesting. I hadn't actually thought about this, about how close to us the cameras would be. But anyway, from getting back onto the theme, 3 themes endure, I would argue, in terms of how these ceremonies have been put together and how they are delivered today to the nation in the UK and to the world. And I would say there are 3 fusions. There is a national Protestantism with a small p. England, as Shakespeare said, that sceptred isle, that little island there of Europe, that distinct place to much of the continent. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, a place of great turmoil, religious turmoil, and England standing alongside the Netherlands and the German states and Scandinavia as one of those Protestant powers in the north of Europe, and very defining for the way that Britons see themselves. So a national Protestantism, although the word Protestant has dropped out of the national conversation, apart from in Northern Ireland, where it is still very much alive and well in people's consciousness. So a national Protestantism. Combined with that, a deep Catholicism, although because of our religious struggles in the 16th and 17th centuries, Catholicism became reinvented as medievalism. That was a way of being Catholic, but without being doctrinally Catholic. So a looking back to chivalry, a looking back to the great Catholic buildings of Europe, an embracing of that. And then finally, in the more modern era, from the late 19th century and the early 20th century into today, the spirit of remembrance. And I will talk about these things as I now move through the lecture. All these things are fused together to give us the shape of the state ceremonial worship of the royal household. Some of it, the question is, the strength, of course, is that it is very familiar. You all know, sat here in New York City, you all know what to expect when you see a royal service. You'll know immediately what that's going to look like. You'll have an idea of what you're going to see. You're going to see pomp and ceremony. You're going to see the military. You're going to hear beautiful music in great Gothic buildings. So that's a great strength. Others may say, is that a nostalgic thing? Is it a thing that roots Great Britain too much in the past? So that's one of the tensions that we are thinking about all the time. How can this state ceremonial religious service, how can that be both contemporary and also traditional? How can it speak to a new generation while maintaining the depth of all of these things that are here? And that's not just a question for us in the ecclesiastical household, it's a question for all churches. It's a question for this church, and it's a question for the Church of England, the Episcopal Church. Relevance and continuity, the two things. So, I'm going to dive now into the theological background of state religion. And this comes out of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Book of Common Prayer was an attempt at conformity, a common prayer. There had been various types of liturgies and rites, a rite of Hereford, a rite of Sarum. Each of these places in England had their own slightly different approach to liturgy. And Archbishop Cranborough fused these into a Book of Common Prayer. And if you look at the beginning of the Book of Common Prayer, 1662, there's a wonderful attempt to explain this, why some things be retained and some things be not retained. And a lot of the Catholic, more extremely Catholic things were taken out at this stage of the Book of Common Prayer. And more of the Protestant theology, a fusion mostly of Martin Luther, but some of John Calvin, came into the Book of Common Prayer, making it a Protestant book. The first one, 1549, was particularly Catholic. The 1552 prayer book had swung because the boy king Edward VI had got quite Calvinist advisors. That prayer book swung to a more Protestant type of Anglicanism. And the 1662 version, which most of us are familiar with and which most people would go to as the English Book of Common Prayer, that was a fusion. That was a sort of a coming together of these various strains of Protestant theology to again be an attempt at conformity. Now, interestingly, days of national observance were put into the prayer book during the 17th century. The first one was put in after the failed attempt of Guy Fawkes and his colleagues to blow up the king at the opening of Parliament on November the 5th, 1605. I'm just going to read you the preamble to this series of prayers in the Book of Common Prayer. Many malignant and devilish papists, Jesuits, and seminary priests, you can get the ecumenical tone straight away of this, much envying and fearing conspired most horribly when the King's most excellent Majesty, the Queen, the Prince, and the Lords, spiritual and temporal, and commons, should have been assembled in the upper house of Parliament upon the 5th day of November, in the year of our Lord 1605, suddenly to have blown up the said whole house with gunpowder, an invention so inhuman, barbarous, and cruel as the like was never heard of before. To which all reply, Amen. So that was placed into the Book of Common Prayer to be read in all parishes on the 5th of November, to remember that these malignant and devilish Jesuits and seminary priests are out there and they're trying to blow you up. That was the first one. The second one was the salvation of Dublin Castle from the rebellion of 1641. Little known, it was in the Irish edition. The rebellion of the rebellion in Ireland was a terrible, terrible thing. It was the most appalling effusion of bloodshed and murder by both sides, and it lives on in the memory to this day. Extraordinary story again. Sadly, not time to go into that. The next one was, of course, Charles, King and Martyr, the execution of King Charles I in January 1649, followed by the restoration of King Charles II in 1660, prayers put in again. And then the final one, the Glorious Revolution. That's when William and Mary took over in 1688. Very important also for America in terms of things like the Bill of Rights and the understanding of liberty. A fascinating little anecdote about that, which Dutch William was married to the King's daughter, James' second daughter, Mary, and Mary, in effect, overthrew her father, which was quite extraordinary, because James had become a Roman Catholic in exile during our Civil War, and it was thought, trying to re-Catholicize the nation. a group of people, we're told a group of 5 people, so the story goes, whose initials were C-A-B-A-L, Cabal, a group of 5 people, wrote to the stadtholder, William, and his English princess, to say, come and save us from this terrifying king who, like our great enemy Louis XIV, the Sun King, is trying to purge all the Protestants as Louis was in France. So a Dutch fleet sailed around with the Dutch army down to Devon, to Torbay, and on November the 4th, they were due to land. But Bishop Compton, who was with Dutch William and Queen, the Princess Mary's husband, he said, wait one day, set foot in England on November the 5th, the national day of observance of our salvation. So it was a very early piece of info operations, as we say in the army, a very early piece of using dates and times to reinforce this messaging. And of course, William's army proceeded up towards London. James's army came down to fight him at Salisbury. Overnight, though, James's generals, including the Earl of Marlborough, they switched sides and they joined William's army. James fled. And that battle did happen. It happened in a place called the Boyne, when James and William faced off in Ireland for the crown. But I just throw that one in because that also became a day of prayer of thanksgiving for the salvation of the nation. There is one other. All of those are not in the prayer book. If you come into the Chapel Royal and open your prayer book and look for them, you will not find them because they were taken out. I'll explain why in a moment. They were taken out. The one that survives is the Accession Day, which we celebrate as the day when the king assumes the role of sovereign. And it's always the day of demise of the late sovereign. And so Accession Day is observed certainly in the Chapels Royal, I hope around the country, but I would be surprised if everybody around the country is doing it. But the Accession Day remains a very big day of state ceremonial observance. So why did these disappear? These other services, why did they disappear? The reason was there was a rebellion in 1776 in America. There was a revolution in 1789 in France. There was a Napoleonic War. And then there were revolutions throughout Europe in which the age of reform, the age of Catholic emancipation, all of these things began to happen as the old elites lost their power and the new mercantile elites, the new industrial elites began to take power. And that meant that the age of reform meant that these things that were peculiarly anti-Catholic were all taken out of the liturgy. And the Catholic Church was brought back into Britain. It was re-established. Catholic dioceses were re-established, and Catholics who had been disbarred from civil and military service were allowed back into the mainstream during this period. And Queen Victoria signed off the removal of all of these anti-Catholic services in the 1850s. So that is the sort of Protestant background to the state ceremonial. They developed out of that Reformation conflict, which I've just explained a little bit about. The age of reason, the age of enlightenment, of course, then the age of revolution, and then the age of popular democracy, even in Britain as well. All of those things were changing it. Empire, Britain's overseas empire, would again reshape the way that this ceremonial services were offered, because of course if you were in Ottawa or if you were in Wellington, New Zealand, or if you were in Sydney, Australia, when you did civic events, they mirrored exactly the way they were done in the United Kingdom. So they were exported overseas around what was the once British Empire, now the Commonwealth. That reshaped again the way in which ceremony was offered. And the great thing about that, of course, was that the Book of Common Prayer, hymns ancient and modern, and the King James Bible were exported all around the British Empire. And I was very privileged as a young man, having my family coming from a coal background in Lancashire. From being a young boy, we had family in New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada, wherever there was coal, there were our people, mining engineers. And so by the age of 21, I've been in the Australian desert and found little chapels there with the Book of Common Prayer, hymns ancient and modern. And then I've been up to Hudson's Bay, up in the very north of Canada, and again finding the Book of Common Prayer and hymns ancient and modern. So it was gently spread across the whole of that old world. And it was refined again with the Great War in 1914, which brought an end to that old world. That sort of ended Britain's empire. It would take another 30 or 40 years to become the Commonwealth. And theologically, quite interesting what happened there, because this is the cenotaph. This is the opening of the cenotaph in 1920, I think. We still do that parade, the Chapel Royal choruses, we still sound there for the service. And that's the unknown warrior who's being brought past on a gun carriage, so it's probably 1919. There was a real problem in the First World War because so many people were killed. 1 million, approximately, British soldiers, sailors and airmen were killed in the Great War. In one day at the Battle of the Somme, 36,000 people were killed in one morning at the Battle of the Somme. And these were civilian soldiers. These were not the hardcore British soldiers and sailors of the Victorian era. And the liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer had no real words to deal with this. The service had been stripped out of a lot of its sort of content because of fears of prayers for the dead. Prayers for the dead did not happen. Gradually, with the horrible experience of the First World War, prayers for the dead began to reappear in the national consciousness, because how on earth can we understand what has happened in this cataclysmic event called the Great War? And it's interesting, in the East End of London, little shrines had started to develop on street corners for those who died, and gradually we've seen the movement from that period into the contemporary period, where now prayers for the dead are absolutely mainstream, and the newer liturgies that the Church of England developed include them. That would have been anathema to the earlier generations. So what you're seeing, I would argue, is that you're seeing this conversation historically between the past and the present, and what is being held on to and what is changing. And it's a conversation that is in constant motion to this day. So state religion, what are the challenges for us? I put this slide up, and it says, Portsmouth Mayor walks into ceremony to Metallica. Now, my son informs me that Metallica are a popular music ensemble, apparently. So it gets better. So in his address, the Mayor of Portsmouth, a very fine naval city on the south coast, decided to address the gathered council in Klingon from the television show Star Trek. So this is quite interesting, because here you've got a chap who's in all the robes of the town, the city, but being rather curious in his choices. And it reminds me a little of Chesterton's great quote that, you know, those who don't believe, they don't believe nothing, they believe anything. You know, which so who is this guy? Well, what is interesting is that he's part of a great church called St Mary's Portsea, one of the finest Anglo-Catholic churches in the country. He's a communicant member. I think he's a member of the parish council, the equivalent of the vestry. And this remarkable photo, you might not be able to see Cosmo Gordon Lang as the vicar of St Mary's Portsea. Now, those are the curates. In 1901, a man called Tubby Clayton is there, who was a great army chaplain who founded the Toc-H movement. When the Australian cricket team first came to England, by ship of course in those days, for the first ever tour of Australia against England, that's a big deal for us, the Ashes it's called now, it's a huge sporting thing. The first team they played on English soil were the curates of St Mary's Portsea. And that is a remarkable thing, that in those days that church could provide a team of cricketers to play the Australian national team. That parish, with the great Archbishop as its rector, very much at the heart of Anglo-Catholicism, very much a model church of the Edwardian era. But interesting that the gentleman is now the Lord Mayor of Portsmouth. He's steeped in this, but yet chooses Metallica and Klingon to talk to the generation today. So this is the challenge for us, really. What is civic religion today? How do we accommodate ourselves with the secular age? I've put in the formal dinners because Lincoln's Inn was the most Puritan inn of the Inns of Court where barristers train. They've all got chapels. They all have a deep history. The Temple Church goes back to the deep Middle Ages, and you may have seen that it's the most famous one. But Lincoln's Inn does not have a chaplain. It has a preacher. So that's quite interesting. It's a preacher. Now, Lincoln's Inn last year decided to drop the Christian grace that they have used for, I think, about 5 centuries, to have a secular grace. Well, what is a secular grace? Who is being thanked and why, we would ask. But this is the type of changes that are going across institutions, especially universities in the United Kingdom. Where do we see a continuity with the old? With the armed forces, my world, yes, the armed forces continues to have padres and continues to have church parades, continues to have graces. But all these things are being questioned. Why do we do it? Why are we doing that? Well, part of the reason we're doing it is because the head of state in our country, UK, is the head of church. He's the supreme governor of the Church of England, and the Church of England is open to all people of faith or no faith. As long as we have that connection, the place of religion is assured within places like the armed forces, but less so in other institutions. That's just something to think about. So, state religion today, we can certainly say that the ceremonial Protestantism remains. The medievalism that we saw at Coronation, we saw at the Royal Funeral, the Royal Maundy, I'll talk about these in a moment. Traditional, yes. Now, put high church or low church short, because I was told on appointment, Padre Wright, Her Majesty the Queen is neither high church nor low church because she does short church. So, because she does lots of church. Therefore, in the Chapel Royal, it's always short church. Quite interesting because Her late Majesty and the King, both very articulate and spiritual people, but yet they do a lot of this, so our services tend to be quite condensed, really. So the coronation, let me just sort of, in this last, I'm conscious of time, this last 10 minutes, just to run you through something about the coronation. I show this picture, this is the Chapel Royal St James's Palace where I live and work. The window of the Golden Jubilee of Elizabeth II, and beneath it, the anointing screen. Now, if you come to Evensong today, you will hear Zadok the priest, the great anthem of Handel, and I'll run through to it in a second, but that's quite important. So, but first of all, some of the background things about the coronation. So the date. Traditionally, Coronation Day, for a king, not a queen, for a king, is St George's Day. And our coronation was actually on the 6th of May last year. But if you count back 13 days in the old Julian calendar, our coronation day was the 23rd of April, which was a rather nice, subtle nod to the past and to Charles II there, who's being crowned in 1661 in the same place, in the same chair, I think with the same crown. So that deep continuity. The actual day, though, was the May day of the coronation, corresponded with this day, St John before the Latin Gate, a minor festival in the Book of Common Prayer. And I think it's this line here, in the midst of the street of it was there the tree of life, which bare these manner of fruit for the healing of the nations. And the eagle on top of the screen, which I'm going to talk about, is also the ampulla, which carries the sacred anointing oil for the king, which is from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. And what we were seeing in that service was this deep fusion, deep in symbolism and mystery. So the king came forward to be crowned. We had not seen this for 70 years. None of us there from the Lord Chamberlain's office, the royal household, had ever seen a coronation. So this was quite an important moment. How was this going to be received by the nation, and what was going to happen? How are we going to do it? The plan for London Bridge was this thick, the Queen's funeral. The plan for the coronation was this thick, because the Queen was never going to die, you see. It was quite obvious the Queen would live forever. And when I was appointed to this role, I served with the Gurkhas, our Nepalese soldiers, and the Gurkha major, who's a lovely man, Nepalese soldier, he ran me up to congratulate me, and he said, Padre, he said, you go to work for a woman who is a mini goddess, in his Hindu understanding. And the Queen was, so we all thought that the Queen would live forever. And so therefore, coronation was thought about, but it was always on the back burner. We'll do that next time. Anyway, the coronation happens. This glorious window of the Chapel Royal, the Tree of Life, from that day, chosen by the King, because the King comes to the Chapel Royal, and from his seat where he comes forward for communion, he sees the Tree of Life above the altar. He was transformed into this amazing coronation screen. And if you remember in the service, the soldiers carried that screen around him, and Zadok the priest was sung. Now the reason for this, queens, when they're crowned, are under a canopy, because they are anointed on the hands for their works, on the head for their thoughts. But a king is anointed upon his heart, his chest, because a king goes into battle and has to fight. Hence why a screen surrounds the king, so the king can strip down to his shirt, open his shirt, and be anointed upon his heart. In the Middle Ages, kings would go into battle in armour, and therefore to be anointed, to be given that anointing, was part of kingship, because you would have to fight on the battlefield, and therefore as king you would need to be anointed to give you that sense of grace. And you know, many of our English kings actually fought in hand-to-hand combat in the Middle Ages, so it's a throwback to that era. We were led in by the Cross of Wales, and I'm half Welsh in effect, so a great thing for us. Pope Francis had sent a relic of the True Cross to go into the processional cross that led the King's procession into the Abbey. Wonderful story, wonderful gift from Pope Francis, and I was told by the nuncio that it was almost definitely brought by St. Helena back from the Holy Land to Rome. And that little fragment you can see was placed within the Cross of Wales. A great ecumenical gesture that the King's coronation begins walking behind this relic. Imagine what I read to you about malignant papists. You know, imagine how the change over the centuries has come full circle, and we have relics again as part of the state ceremonial. That's part of this conversation between the past and the present. A beautiful moment for us in the service was the beginning. And this is one of our choristers, Sam, in the livery that you've seen and will see today. And he's addressing the King. The opening words of the service. He's saying, on behalf of the children of this country, I welcome you in the name of the King of Kings. And His Majesty replied, in his name, I come here to serve and not to be served. So the opening lines of the coronation, magnificent. And this young man walking forwards with billions of people probably watching him, all these camera things, you know, and he did that perfectly. One of our team said to him, are you going to write it down on your hand, just in case, you know? And he said, oh no, I can remember that. So, now that's an innovation. This is the first time this has happened, and it was through a conversation between His Majesty and the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's the first coronation that has begun like this, because the world has changed, and now His Majesty, a great environmentalist, a great man of faith, he wishes to be a servant king for the whole nation. Really, really special. But that servant kingship does go back into the 17th century. I just want to show you, this is called the Angel. You can see St. George, you can see the ship. In the 17th century, you could come to the palace, the Chapel Royal, and you could be touched for the king's evil, which was a disease called scrofula. And you would come forward and the king would touch you, and it was meant to have a healing property. And then my predecessor, when you had been touched for the king's evil, would place around your neck this little tiny piece of gold. It's a tiny, tiny gold coin called an angel, and you were given that, and then off you went. And it was thought that the king had magical healing powers. That stopped with Queen Anne in the early 1700s, when King George I came over from Germany and thought this was all rather nonsense. We're not doing that anymore. But it lives on in the service called the Royal Maundy, and on Maundy Thursday, that's from York 2 years ago. But on Maundy Thursday, we did the Royal Maundy service, where for 75 people that equate to the King's age are given, men and women, 75 men, 75 women, are given some Maundy money. This is a tiny, tiny little coins, and they are given as an act of Christian humility by the King to thank them. The early Stuarts had washed the feet of the poor, which is why in the service we all carry flowers, because the smell of the poor was quite overwhelming, and therefore the king and the clergy carried flowers and had incense. That stopped with James II. But it's a lovely thing, and it all of those items, the ship, the sign of the ship, the coins, the royal touch, the king placing the gift into your hands, the flowers, the yeoman, were all at the king's evil. It's the only service. If you have an award, if you are given an award, you go to Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, you go to the king, you receive your award. The Royal Maundy, the king comes to you in your seat in the cathedral. Servant kingship. So it has always been there, but the king has chosen this as one of his key themes. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to run through the last things. You will see us, the state ceremonial services today, in the orders of chivalry, these great orders of knighthood that go back into the Middle Ages, and also on Remembrance Sunday, which I talked about a little earlier. The state funerals. That was an amazing moment. David there at Windsor, he is placing the crown that was given to the Queen on Coronation Day 1953. David's putting the crown back on the altar. I'm stood there. David was my vicar in Cambridge, so it was quite extraordinary to be stood there with David and watching this crown being put back upon the altar. Extraordinary. And when we were in Westminster Abbey for the funeral service, there were the great words of our sovereign lady, Queen Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, defend all the wonderful titles. When the coffin came down to us in Windsor, David, opening prayer, talked about our sister Elizabeth. From the greatness of the grandeur of Westminster Abbey to this more intimate burial, and the Queen becoming our sister Elizabeth again, and her crown being returned to the altar. And then to see the crown being picked up again to be placed upon the king's head the following year. A remarkable continuity of time and space. And we wondered how the British public would deal with the coronation. You know, this rather strange thing of all these symbols and orbs and sceptres and swords and crowns, and yet the British public embraced this in a wonderful way. They embraced this as if we did it every week. It became a common prayer. So these things endure. Royalty, pageantry, the great spaces, medievalism, as it was in the beginning, is now and ever shall be. And then down to, I'd just like you to read that, because it says it better than I can. This is about the death of the Queen. And for those who can't read that, I'll read that out. Now, her death has unlocked a latent appetite for religious ritual, even transcendence. Often among avowed atheists and agnostics, many who rarely set foot in a church have found themselves popping in for a service or to sign a book of condolence. How remarkable that in our age of unbelief, this traditional funeral, an unambiguous statement of Anglican faith, drew one of the biggest audiences in TV history. Cynical secularists usually dominate social media, but this week they've been sounded vaguely ridiculous. Many viewers reported being more moved by the simpler Windsor committal than the pomp and pageantry of the Abbey service and procession. They were mesmerised by the religious elements, not in spite of them. There's a brilliant piece in the Daily Telegraph after the funeral. And so it's a really wonderful piece. And she says basically what you saw on the television is available in your parish church or cathedral all around the country and all for free. And that was brilliant. And the Chapel Royal ceiling, reminding us of the beauty of holiness, the wedding of 1540 to Anne of Cleves. But the key thing for me, as in the wonderful role that I'm allowed to minister in, is the continuity of the royal family. There we see that lovely photograph of the 4 generations. A great piece of British continuity. Things may change in the politics, things may change in the world, but ultimately this royal family, this domestic royal family that is like your family and my family with its ups and downs, it endures and continues into the future and reminds us of those deep Christian roots, servant kingship, openness, all of these things change to the modern world, but holding on to the traditions of the past. And I think that photo, if anything, encapsulates what we in the ecclesiastical household serve and what we support and which we hope will flourish into the future as it was in the beginning. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very, very much.